Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 18th, 2024. I know it's not Friday, but I've gotten some questions that I think absolutely require an answer. And so that's what I'm going to be doing today. The question that in particularly caught my eye was someone who wrote in and asked, how is it that the U.S. and the West can proceed unchecked and unaccountable with violations, criminal violations of international law? And why do the American and European populations accept this and take it for granted that our governments are acting as rogue nations in violation of what they proclaim to be a rules-based order? Now, I don't have time in the daily update to review all the counts of this, but there are numerous. But let me pick the most immediate and most relevant, which is the example of the European Union and the United States issuing new sanctions against Iran following the Iran drone and missile attack on Israel last weekend. Now, what we've seen is condemnations. This is unacceptable. It's unprovoked aggression by Iran. No nation can tolerate this. Over and over and over, the solemn declarations that Israel has a right to retaliate, that Iran must be punished, and on and on and on. Not a mention of the Israeli provocation of the strike against the Iranian consulate and embassy in Damascus, Syria, which was an absolute violation of international law, the targeting of a sovereign nation, because an embassy is part of a sovereign nation, in another nation, which killed 13 civilians and 2 top leaders of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. No condemnation of that. Perhaps most blatant was Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, who was asked, what would Britain do if one of its embassies or consulates were targeted? And without hesitation at all, he said there would be a harsh response. And then he was asked, well, why would you not accept this with Iran? And he looked like the classic case of a deer whose eyes are caught by the headlights. What was his answer? Well, Iran is outside of international law. That's the hypocrisy that's turning the world against the West more and more every single day. We see it with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, unprovoked attack by Iran. You see it with the lying spokesman for the National Security Council and the State Department, who refused to condemn Israeli genocide in Gaza. No cut in aid for Israel. They say, oh, it's so horrible what's happening to the women and children, and then turn around and try to push through the Congress $14 billion more in aid to Israel. And many of the so-called conservatives who oppose the policies of the deep state then turn around and support the funding of Israel, which is what? That's the policy of the deep state. So we see further the EU summit that condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine and reiterated support for Ukraine and its defense and the need for billions of dollars of new weapons. And what's the lie that was underlying the whole Ukraine-Russia proxy war? That Russia's February 2022 special military operation was unprovoked. A lie. It was provoked by 8 years of killing of Ukrainian citizens of Russian descent in the Donbass. That was the result of the coup, the illegal coup pulled off by Victoria Nuland and the State Department and George Soros in February 2014. So this is an example of unaccountable and unchecked lying and aggression coming from the West in an example of completely off-the-wall hypocrisy. Now, the action, the comments against Iran, the sanctions against Iran, the refusal to condemn Israel, the continued push for the proxy war in Ukraine, all of this exposes not only the fraud of the U.S. recitation of the defense of the rules-based order, but it's totally discrediting the governments of the United States and Europe in the eyes of most of the rest of the world. And you can throw in the pathetic amen corner from countries such as Canada, Australia, Japan, who are turning themselves also into, well, have actually been complete puppet states of this global military industrial complex. And that's what Europe is. There's no sovereign nation of Germany, no sovereign nation of France. They're merging into this Anglo-American imperial strike force to defend the corruption of the corporate cartels of Wall Street, the City of London, and their governments in Western Europe and the United States. Now, the real target of all this is not Iran. It's not Russia. I mean, it is Russia, but it's not defense of Ukraine. The real target is the emergence of a new system, an anti-colonial system, which has been postponed over the last 50 years by continuous war, but with governments in the global south now saying, no more. You cannot exploit our raw materials, our labor. You cannot do this any longer because we now have a commitment to sovereignty, and it's being backed up by the economic power of the BRICS nations. And that's what the real target is of the globalist central bank dictatorship, to defeat this alternative, to keep the world safe for a unipolar hegemonic US order. Now, why are governments turning against the West? Well, what is the point of the hypocrisy and the corruption? It's to allow the continuation of looting and exploitation, the swindle of the colonial system. For many, many years, whenever a government raised its head against it, they risked being overturned in a coup, assassinated. Look at what Cameron organized to destroy the nation of Libya. Why? Because Gaddafi was looking at the possibility of an African monetary fund backed by gold, oil, and water projects. Why was Saddam targeted? Not because he had weapons of mass destruction, that was a lie. It was because he was on the same line as Gaddafi, looking at the potential for an alternative to the petrodollar system. Why is Russia targeted? Because Putin said, you cannot steal our resources the way the West tried to do in the 1990s when Yeltsin was put in and the so-called shock therapy policy reduced the Russian population and the life expectancy by 5 to 7 years in order to carry out a looting of Russian raw materials and the takeover of Russian state industry. So this is the injustice of the current global order, which is being challenged. It's being challenged by the Palestinians who are refusing to surrender in Gaza. And what we see now is that Israel has been exposed to the world as an unlawful nation, that regardless of what happened on October 7th, it doesn't give Israel the right to kill civilians, especially women and children. It doesn't give them a right to attack embassies in other countries. That this is a right that they have taken to themselves and is defended by the lying hypocrites in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere. Now, look at what's going on in the US Congress. You have on the one hand the agreement to continue warrantless surveillance in FISA. This is something that supposedly conservatives opposed, but they knuckled under and supported. They're now, under Speaker Johnson, about to vote up $60 billion more for Ukraine and $14 billion more for Israel. Look at the Justice Department attacks on Trump. Say what you will about Donald Trump, but they're trying to ruin his presidential campaign just as they destroyed his presidency with the lies and corruption of Russiagate. And then look at the collapse of US cities and infrastructure. This is what they're covering up with their wars. And they're trying to protect the bloated debt system by looting the developing sector and now the American and European citizens themselves. Now, why do they get away with it? Why do the Americans and the Europeans tolerate it? Well, we exist in a world of censorship and promoted narratives. Promoted by who? The same cartels that run the media are the ones that are tied in the raw material concerns, the financial cartels, and so on. They have created narratives so you don't know what's true, and they've created a culture to depress and demoralize citizens so that with no sense of a future, the so-called green agenda and so on, people end up looking for drug-induced stupors. The streaming of sports and entertainment, gaming, gawking at celebrities. This is now considered culture instead of thinking, instead of the traditions of the classical Renaissance, which ennoble man. What we're seeing is man reduced to the most basic instincts, animal instincts, deliberately so by a Hobbesian British Empire, which believes that there are too many people and that the way to reduce the population is to essentially turn them into animals fighting in a war of each against all. Now, I urge you, take the time to watch the two videos that I'm linking to today's description section. One is the April 13th conference that was sponsored by the Schiller Institute on the Oasis Plan. This is an approach to break away from the present world order and to create a development perspective that is the real essence of how you can achieve peace, how you achieve trust and understanding between peoples who have come through brutal wars. And then I'd also encourage you to watch my discussion yesterday with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, where she takes up these issues as well. What we need is to upgrade the political and emotional level of thinking of our fellow citizens. That's our responsibility. That's what I try to do by making these updates. That's what I encourage you to do by taking these ideas into the streets, into the discussion process, into the churches, the workplaces, the family gatherings. Let's transform the populations from drug-induced comas of toleration of unbearable, horrible actions and create the beautiful humanity that was embodied in the ideas behind the Golden Renaissance and the great religions of the world. Tomorrow's Friday. I'll be taking your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com, and I look forward to hearing from you between now and then.